Good evening, Sin City, and welcome to a very special edition of the Las Vegas Social Media Show. We have with us today media entrepreneur, content specialist, and hip-hop pioneer, Mr. Jonathan Shecter, a.k.a. Shecky Green. Shecky is the founding editor-in-chief of The Source magazine, executive producer at Screenworks, and also the director of programming at the Wynn Las Vegas nightclubs. Shecky, welcome to the Las Vegas Social Media Show, sir.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, we really appreciate having you. This is a real treat. So that was a brief bio on yourself. Can you tell us a little more about yourself? How'd you get into media? A little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in Philadelphia, and as a young kid, I was always drawn to media and music. Those are the two things that kind of attracted me from day one. Music in particular, I became a music fan as young as I can remember, and I'm just old enough to have been around when hip hop started in 1980 in the early 80s, and I was a little kid that loved it and was a fan of it. And essentially, as my life went on, my interests started to converge, and I figured out ways to bring my love of music and passion for music and my interest in all forms of media. That's the written word, the printed word, the audio and like radio content to video content to internet content. So I'm into all those things, and basically tried to figure out ways as I went through my career to bring those interests together. And that's kind of what I'm doing here in Vegas and throughout my career.
Okay, so leading into the next question, how'd you end up in Vegas?
Well, I started hanging out in Vegas actually in the late 90s, more so like anyone would, just as a place to go on vacation and a place to, escape. I grew up on the East Coast, like I said. I'm from Philly, and I lived in New York City for a very long time, like 13 years before I came here. So I, kind of was hanging out. I like to play poker. That's one of my hobbies.
Nice.
And, I saw a lot of opportunity way back then. And then it wasn't until 2003 that I permanently moved here. So I've been here for almost 10 years now. I guess you could say 10 years. And it's been an interesting ride. I think I've came right at the right time for what the world that I'm in now, which is the nightclubs and DJs. And that's kind of it was a natural interest of mine from prior to me living in Las Vegas. In New York City, I was involved in some stuff like that. And now coming out here, I sort of rode that wave, and now I find myself, at what I consider to be sort of the epicenter of the nightclub world in America, which is at the Wynn.
No, and that's very cool, and it's kind of unique how you've just been there from the beginning with the hip hop DJs and to the evolution to what it is now today with all the superstar DJs, and obviously at all the Wynn nightclubs. It's just phenomenal. Yeah,
it's been interesting. I mean, sometimes my hip-hop friends, kind of take offense when I try to draw comparisons between the two movements, but actually I see a lot of similarities.
Right.
I see that, DJing is DJing. Whatever genre of music you're playing, whatever it is, you still have to be a good DJ. And that's the common denominator. Even though the technology has changed, the setup has changed, the expectations of both the crowd and the DJ have changed. A lot of things have changed, and of course the style of music has come a long way also. But in spite of all that, there's a lot of similarities between when I would go see a DJ, like say in like the early 90s in New York. I was around a lot of like, what we call golden era hip hop moments, and all the DJs and artists that were around then. And now come to, nowadays in 2013, Avicii, David Guetta, and all these kind of guys, and Eric Prydz, Calvin Harris. I've been lucky to kind of have a front row seat to see and be involved in a business level with them, and so it's been really interesting. But actually, I see a continuum. I see it almost as a straight line from one to the other. It's all about entertaining a crowd and being a good DJ. Although some of the caveats and sort of expectations have changed.
Right. And that's very interesting, and that leads me into the question. Obviously, you've been out here for that whole entire explosion. Because now the DJs are like what the artists used to be. They are the main attraction. They are the act. All the big names out there. Did you see this coming, or maybe you saw it coming, but did you think it reached the level that it's at right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like here in Las Vegas, when I first moved here in the early 2000s, that was really when this modern era of the nightclubs started. There was always a couple clubs, prior to that, and they had DJs, but. Right. It was the opening of Light nightclub at the Bellagio in 2003 that kind of signaled the start of this bottle service era, and with it, the idea of having a DJ that's sort of the center attraction. And really early on, I met up with Sean Christie, who's now the managing partner of Surrender and Encore Beach Club at the Wynn, and we started talking about DJs like literally 10 years ago. And the first DJs that I brought here were DJ AM, Mark Ronson, Stretch Armstrong, and DJ Premier, for basically hip hop DJs. I mean, for lack of a better term, even though all of them, of course, AM passed away, and rest in peace to him. But what they did was essentially what in a hip hop style. Whether or not they played everything, but it was the beginning of what we call open format DJing, which was the idea of you go to a club and you play everything. And AM, of course, was the king of that, and I was really heavily involved in his career, especially here in Vegas. And there was a time in the mid-2000s, I'm talking like 04, 05, 06, 07, that AM really ruled Las Vegas. And, the style that he pioneered of, some call it mashup, some call it open format, whatever you want to call it, that became the norm. So it's been a long road, and then there was a time when, during that time, the house music scene was confined to usually like the back room. Like there was for example, Jet nightclub at the Mirage.
Yeah.
Had it's no longer there, and now it's One Oak, but they had like a small house room. So the hip hop or open format was in the main room, and then house was like
the outcast,
the back room with like 100 people in it.
Yeah.
But then again, if you go back even further, there was a club called Utopia, which was kind of like a really important club in Las Vegas. It was right on the Strip. It was a standalone building that's right next to MGM, kind of where the Fat Burger is now.
Okay.
And in that area, there was a club, and that was all house music. So there's always been a presence of dance music or house music in Las Vegas, but only in the last, I'd say, 4 years, particularly as we move towards right now, where this has become the center of not only the clubs, but it seems like all of Las Vegas. I mean, you drive through... if a visitor arrives here and they drive out of the airport, every billboard is like an EDM artist.
It's true.
And it's like, so it's very interesting. You mentioned kind of how what an artist once was. I a lot of people draw comparisons to like the Rat Pack era when people would travel to see like Dean Martin. Now they travel and see Avicii. And it's, I think there's a lot of similarities in that sense. And so in a lot of ways, this has become the driving force of this city that we live in. Dance music and DJs have become the centerpiece of Las Vegas.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned DJ AM. I recently read the article you wrote in 2009, I believe, about him, and he just sounds like such a unique, fascinating human being. What was it about him that made him so successful? I read he used to mix, like you said, open format, like AC/DC, and just out-of-the-box things in the nightclub. So if you could just touch on it a little bit, like what made him so special?
Yeah. Well, AM was super talented. I mean, he was the hardest working DJ of all time, and there never will be another one, because he never rested when he was behind the turntables, and it was turntables. Initially it was vinyl, and then it moved on to Serato with vinyl, So when he was behind the turntables, it was like a constant stream of action. There was always something happening. He was always blending two songs together, or scratching something, or doing a wordplay kind of mix from like one song to the next. There was always something happening. He never let the song play. And that was a product of his talent, his very quick mind, and his, physical skill in just able to pull this off. And even before Serato, he was doing this with straight up records. I mean, then once Serato took hold, he was right on the cutting edge of that and was the first to really get the most out of it, because he had the brain to kind of envision this kind of a presentation, like the idea of being able to, as you say, play every genre of music. Was nothing was off limits. It would be 60s, like he'd play like the Animals, like into like AC/DC, into like LL Cool J, into whatever like cutting edge electro was out at the time. He was very, very really like had no limitations as to what he would choose to play. So it was all those things. And then what happened was he also became kind of a celebrity. So along with his genuine talent and his hard-earned sort of status, he also became famous for, like, he was dating Nicole Richie at the time, and that put him on the front page of People magazine. And so a combination of things happened, but it wasn't like a guy that got famous just for being nothing, just like a reality show or something. He actually earned the fame by being an incredible DJ. So
he had substance behind.
Real substance, yeah. I mean, more substance than pretty much any DJ that you see nowadays. And anyone who was lucky enough to see him DJ, they know what I'm talking about. He actually had 3 long residencies here in Vegas. The first was at the Hard Rock. It was when Body English first opened. And then the second one was at Pure at Caesar's Palace. And the third one was at Rain at the Palms. And all 3 of those lasted for a year or 2 each. And they were all, really big. And that kind of cemented his legacy here.
Where do you think he'd want to be now today if he was here with us today? Or what do you think maybe that he'd think of the scene today?
I get that question a lot. Yeah. And I feel like if Adam was here today, he'd be right there in the mix with all these other guys, meaning he'd be playing, what's popular now, which is basically 128 beats per minute, pump your fist, electro, big room, house music. That he'd be playing it, but he'd be doing it in his way. So he'd be still very active, like mixing things and finding innovative ways to bring the sound out there. Because as you know, and you've seen a lot of DJs, I've seen hundreds and hundreds of DJ performances, even in the last couple of years. And every time, there's some good DJs. And don't get me wrong, some of these guys are great producers and some of them are great DJs. But they have literally about 5% of the work that Adam would do in a set, they do. I mean, they do nothing except play songs. Adam would envision these collages of music, that no one could even anticipate. And I think he'd still be doing that, but he'd be playing what's popular now, as he always did. He always wanted to please the crowd. He was always forward-looking, so he'd be right there. In fact, if he was here today, he'd probably have an early copy of the Daft Punk album that's about to come out, and he'd be probably previewing songs from that because he loved Daft Punk too.
And that Pharrell song you posted today has just become one of my favorite songs.
How good is that, man?
Oh, my gosh. It's on my laptop right now, actually. I immediately got it. We got about maybe a minute here, and you've also started DJing yourself over at Andreas. Can you leave us with a little bit about that? Golden Grooves. Sure.
Yes. Basically, I've dabbled in DJing over the years, and you can catch me actually about once a month or so at Andreas on a Wednesday night, which is a restaurant located at the Encore right next to Surrender Nightclub. And what I like to do is play what I call golden era classics, soul, rock, disco, funk, hip-hop, because I think that's missing from today. I like to kind of bring that back. I like to remind people what I think, real music is supposed to sound like.
It's just such a great setting, too, there at Andre. It's just a beautiful, really chill, great place to go right before Surrendered. It's really cool what you guys have done with that. I love that.
Thank you. Appreciate it, man.
What you guys have done. And where can people find you at on social media?
Well, I'm on Twitter quite a bit at Shecky Green, which is SHECKYGREEN. And, of course, on Facebook and all that stuff. But Twitter is kind of I'm a Twitter guy. I love Twitter.
Twitter
So
laptop right over there.
I got a Twitter laptop. Some people love Instagram. Everyone's going crazy with Vine nowadays, which kind of annoys me, but we can talk about that later. But but I love Twitter because I think it's like the simplicity of it is really appealing to me. And the fact that you can kind of get a message out there and you're forced to kind of reduce it to this 140 characters. So it kind of, it's an efficient model, I feel.
And I see a lot of DJs using Twitter, and especially, say Diplo. He's at Surrender this night, but then all of a sudden he's in Brazil, the night. But it's a good way for them to connect, build their fan base, and really feel good. So definitely Twitter. But we're going to go on to another segment. This has been great. We'll be right back.